Move this chair back.
Everybody good?
Yes.
You're okay? The older I get, the more convinced I am that every family has its secret. It's that thing that we're not allowed to tell anybody. And we all kind of got one of those squirreled away somewhere. So this is a story about one family's secret. It's called the Lakeview Motel. When I returned to the Brick Rambler on Decatur Street, I expected old memories to greet me, but not the past I found. After my father's death, Mom called my older sister and me home to triage the contents of the house. Stuff to the dump, stuff to donate, and a final, much smaller pile to sell on eBay. The rest Mom would take to Clayton, 7 miles away, where she would go to live with her brother. Charlie, would you mind tackling Dad's closet? Mom asked. Maddie and I can take on my room. Daddy's girl shot me a bruised glance. As my sister was my father's clear favorite, why was I picked to go through his things? During the turbulent teenage years, she and Mom held brutal yelling matches. They went days without speaking. But in my father's eyes, she could do no wrong. During those same years, my father and I drifted apart. Our relationship cordial, but hardly warm. I took comfort from my mother, leading Maddie to taunt me as the mama's boy. These family divisions help explain why Maddie and I were never close, but they don't account for the lengths we went to torment each other. I suspect the animosity had much to do with the secrets I now know we both harbored. A few years earlier, my father had taken over the guest room, his restlessness at night interfering with Mom's sleep, or so they said. I opened the closet door and ran my hand across the scratchy lapel of the gray tweed jacket my father wore on weekends. I got a whiff of the harsh smoke from the pipe tobacco he favored. His white dress shirts, starched and crisp as a curt reply, were still folded and taped with the thin blue bands of paper from the laundry. After bagging his clothes for delivery to Goodwill, I turned to the upper shelves. From the highest one, I pulled down an old Florsheim shoebox, split along its seam, repaired with Scotch tape, now yellowed. I sat down on the bed and opened the box. Inside, I found cracked photos of Christmases and 4th of July picnics long past, a couple of silver fountain pens, and a small box holding 2 medals from the Vietnam War, a Purple Heart and an Army Commendation Medal. There was a black-handled folding knife, which he used to slit open bills and to peel apples. I slipped that into my pocket. At the bottom of the shoebox lay a travel brochure for the Lakeview Motel on Lake Erie. I closed my eyes for a moment, and the fragrance of pine trees enveloped me, and layered beneath that, something else, moldy and rotten. I shook my head and looked down at the cover of the pamphlet. It had a colorized picture of the single-story motel as it would have appeared when it first opened. Fir trees towered over the 12 adjoining rooms. I turned the brochure over, and there was a picture of the beach leading down to the lake and the pier, and the line of canoes and rowboats ready for rent. My stomach queased, and I wiped away the dampness on my forehead. I set the box down on the floor and lay back on the bed. What's wrong with you? My sister stood at the door. Nothing, I said, sitting up, just taking a break. She hesitated before proceeding down the hall. It was nothing, I thought again, but of course it wasn't nothing. In 1980, when I was 6 and had just finished kindergarten, my father took me up to Lake Erie for a week's fishing. We went every summer until I was 11. We packed the car with jeans, flannel shirts, parkas, swimsuits, in rods and reels and bobbers. Mom would load in several bags of dry goods and a cooler filled with side dishes to heat up with the fish we catch. On the way north, we'd stop at a roadside grocery. My father'd wink at me, and we'd head over to the candy counter and fill a bag with Baby Ruths, Milky Ways, and Snickers. My father would also buy a case of Coke and a couple of bottles of Canadian Club. Our little secret, he'd say, placing his finger along the side of his nose. We'd reach the Lakeview Motel by late afternoon, just in time to drop a line in the cool water under the rickety dock. I'd often thought back to those days. The trip's now a gauzy memory of flycatchers, tanagers, warblers awakening the day, water glistening through the golden morning mist, wooden rowboats, their red paint chipped and peeling, the telltale plummeting of the cork plug and the jerk of the line, bologna or peanut butter sandwiches on white bread, compressed and soggy and delicious. Dreamy afternoons filled with checkers, go fish, reading, and napping on the pine needles in the comforting shade of the fir trees along the bank of the lake. As the sun slipped low in the sky, my father would open the small refrigerator in our room and retrieve a Coke. He'd pop the cap and pass it to me. He'd fill a glass with ice and pour himself a generous splash of Canadian Club. As we drank, he'd fry up the fish we'd caught and heat up one of Mom's dishes, macaroni and cheese or lasagna, or he'd open a can and warm some beans or corn. We'd talk a bit about the day's adventures or simply sit in silence. With interest, I'd watch my father top up his drink with the amber liquid. At home, he only drank an occasional beer. After the sunset, the breezes off the lake would fall and the air would grow still, the evening filled with sounds of crickets and owls and nightingales. I'd crawl into my bed and pull the musty sheet up to my neck. The mattress was lumpy and gave off a sour odor. I'd remembered those days, but until I had held the brochure in my hand, I'd forgotten the dark nights, with their cloying dampness, the smell of rot through the floorboards, the howling of unseen creatures and the screaming of insects through the darkness. Soon, my father would drag one of the metal chairs outside, its legs scraping across the cracked concrete. Over the clink of ice in a glass, I'd hear the voices of women and bursts of laughter. To these sounds and the smell of cigarette smoke and strange perfume drifting in through the window, I'd fall asleep. When I woke at first light, my father would be in the bed next to me, snoring softly. I'd get up and turn on the hot plate under the percolator, just as he had shown me. Soon, to the smell of fresh brewing coffee, he'd stir, and another day at the lake would begin. I noticed early on that the women in the room next to ours only stayed a night or two, never accompanied by husbands or kids. In the early years, I paid this little mind, but as our summer visits to the lake went by, I found it odd, out of place. During the summer when I was 11, my unease grew. One night I awoke to find myself alone. There was no sound of laughter, no ice clinking, nor any smell of smoke or perfume. I got up and opened the front door. Two empty metal chairs rested against the wall. A tin ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts lying between them. Two sweating glasses sat on the windowsill of the adjoining room, from which I heard a murmur. The curtain had been pulled hastily, and a gap the width of my hand separated its two drapes. I placed my face to the screen. A bedside light illuminated my father, lying naked on his back. A woman straddled him, my father cupping her large breasts in his hands. She rose and sank rhythmically above him, her eyes closed, and her face tilted to the ceiling. I knew I shouldn't be seeing this, but I couldn't look away. As I shifted my hand on the windowsill, I knocked over one of the glasses. It tumbled to the walkway and shattered, My father snapped his head toward the window, and our eyes locked for a moment before I bolted and fled back to the room. The next morning, we packed our gear and drove home. We never spoke of that night, and we never returned to the Lakeview Motel. As the years passed, my recollection of those trips and our little secrets faded, leaving only glimpses of a small boy sitting in a rowboat, playing checkers and dining on fried bass and catfish and drinking sweet cokes. The rest was forgotten or repressed until now. I reached over and picked up the shoebox, and as I slid the brochure into my pocket, Maddie entered the room. "What's that?" "A box of Dad's stuff. I found it on the top shelf of the closet." She sat down next to me and fingered the items. "You didn't take anything, did you?" "What?" "I saw you put something in your pocket as I was coming into the room." "It's nothing," I said, removing the brochure and showing it to her. She took the pamphlet from me and turned it over and shrugged and handed it back. "Anything else?" "Jesus, Maddie, why are you this way? Do we really have to do this?" She just stared at me. "Fine," I said, and I reached into my other pocket and took out the folding knife. "Just this old knife, it's nothing." "You just can't keep things to yourself. We need to discuss these things," she said, as she took the knife from my hand and opened the blade. "I gave this knife to him. I should have it." "No, you didn't. He always had it." "No, I gave it to him. It was for his birthday. You were too young to remember. It should be mine." "Fine, keep it. It's just an old knife." She closed the blade and tossed it into the air, catching it cleanly. A week later, the house was packed. Maddie drove me to the airport, and on the way we stopped for lunch at Norma's Diner, where we'd hung out during our high school years, drinking malts and eating hamburgers and listening to the latest hits on the old Wurlitzer. As we were having coffee, my sister placed her hands around her cup, took a sip, and asked, "So, are you going to tell me what's going on?" "What do you mean?" "Oh, come on, Charlie, you've been acting weird ever since you cleaned up Dad's closet. You're not pissed off about that knife, are you?" I set aside a napkin I'd been shredding and leaned back in my chair. A part of me wanted my sister to preserve the myth of her father as the dutiful husband, the loving parent, the honorable man. A less noble part wanted to show her what I knew. The man she considered to be such a paragon was deeply flawed. For whatever reasons, and probably the wrong ones, I decided she had a right to the truth. Yet I gave her one more chance. "Sure you want to know?" She looked at me for a moment, perhaps sensing a door about to open that she might prefer sealed. Then she nodded. "Give." So I told the story of my 6 summers at the Lakeview Motel. I could see the change in her eyes as she rewrote her own history. I could almost see the cracks appear and spread in the iconic portrait she had created over the years of my father. I realized too late there was nothing in my telling that would gain me any sympathy. Rather, I could see we would drift further apart in the years ahead, and she would never forgive me for telling her the tale and the consequences for her own story. When I finished, my sister signaled the waitress for more coffee. "I think we better head to the airport," I said. She looked at her watch. "We've got time for one more cup." So we sat in silence for a couple of minutes until the tension in the air led me to ask, So, she said, as the waitress turned away from topping up her coffees. Maddie looked at me and, apparently reaching a decision, tried to smile, but failed. Instead, she tilted her head to one side and asked, "Ever wonder what Mom did while you and Dad were fishing?"